Now joined by Vivek Kaju, who served as India's ambassador to Afghanistan. Ambassador Kaju, thanks very much indeed for talking to us this evening. Now, let me begin by asking you, this is clearly an untenable situation. The UK has called it extremely risky. The France has asked Iran to preserve the 2015 deal, and India has asked for restraint. But how do you see this situation panning out in the next few days or weeks, and how can India actually navigate this space?
There is naturally enormous anger in Iran and in the Shia populations of West Asia, and I dare say South Asia, at the killing of Qassem Soleimani. Qassem Soleimani was undoubtedly a charismatic figure in Iran and in Shia sections of West Asia. Now, the question at this moment is, what are Iran's options? Naturally, Iran has vowed that, and at the level of the supreme leader, who had a close connection with Qassem Soleimani, so they vowed that they will take revenge. But what will be the form of that revenge? Because Iran, at the end of the day, is known to be very realistic and coldly calculating when it comes to the exercise of its foreign policy and security options. Yes, there is a tradition of martyrdom in Iran, but at this time the Iranian leadership would be aware that if they again cross what President Trump may consider a red line, then despite all the diplomatic overtures that the Trump administration is making to convince the major powers and the world that the action against Soleimani was taken because of security considerations, because of self-defense, the exercise of the right to self-defense by the Americans, they know, the Iranians would know that despite all this, President Trump will not hesitate to take action again.
Right.
And to my mind, the Iranians will take some kind of action against American interests, but they'll take it very, very carefully and in a calibrated manner.
Right. Obviously, and the US is also deploying additional troops now in Iraq and in the region. Do you think that the Trump administration has factored in all the possible scenarios after this action, and what kind of escalation that it could possibly mean? Could it even mean war?
Well, naturally the Trump administration would have taken different scenarios before this action was taken. But let us face it, this action was taken by President Trump on account of domestic factors,
yes,
American domestic factors, and on account of external factors. So therefore, President Trump would know full well that having taken this action, he will be on the defensive in trying to ensure that no American life is lost. But he would also know full well that he would have to pursue a very aggressive policy towards Iran, and as he has been doing, but perhaps even a more aggressive policy should Iran, as I said, take a major action against American interests or against the interests of American allies. More the former than the latter. But I feel that Iran too knows this. So while this is a very difficult moment for the region, and naturally all regional countries and countries that have stakes in the West Asian region like India would be monitoring the situation very carefully, I personally feel that the Iranians will be careful and calibrated as I submitted to you.
Right. But, sir, they can still carry out attacks on American assets in the Middle East and, of course, on allies who could be more vulnerable than, of course, an attack on the United States per se. But I want to go back to the point about India and how it can sort of manage this fine balancing act between Iran and the United States, which it has done so far, including with the Chabahar port sanction. But how do you see India's move on this particular aspect?
I think all said and done, the restraint that India has exhibited as of till now in its public articulation after the Soleimani killing has been, to my mind, correct. But as India weighs looks at the scene, it would naturally be mindful as to where its interests lie. It has close connections with Iran, it has cultural ties, it has historical ties, and it wants to preserve all that it can of this relationship. But India, at the end of the day, has far more important interests in its relationship with the US and in its relationship with the Arab Peninsula states. We have enormous interests there. Therefore, at this stage, India would not like the situation to be destabilized because that would cause problems. But India would know that the preponderance of interests are not on the Iranian side of the Gulf, but on the Arab side of the Gulf and beyond the Atlantic.
Okay. I do want to touch upon briefly on what Ambassador Kajui said about the decision that Trump took, and that most of it was possibly also domestic. His critics have, of course, said that he needed a war to distract from his impeachment process. How much do you think that was responsible for the killing of a top commander? This was not just anybody. This was the second most important man in Iran.
As I look at the scene, the impeachment by the Democrats dominated House of Representatives has been a big blow to President Trump. Whatever he may say, he knows that in the Senate it will not pass muster, but it has been a blow. Now, let us not forget that 40 years ago, in 1979, the Iranians attacked the US embassy in Tehran, and they held American diplomats hostage for 400 days. That step cost the then president, and who was a Democrat, President Jimmy Carter, his presidency. His second term he could not get. He lost the election to President Reagan, and one of the prime reasons was the disappointment of the American public with Jimmy Carter's policy towards Iran, his failure in extricating the diplomats. Now, this time around, there was an attack mounted by Shia militias, and President Trump and his administration held Soleimani responsible. This attack was against the American embassy in Baghdad. So there was not a total parallel, but to my mind, President Trump wanted to exhibit the difference between how a Democrat party president of the United States, Jimmy Carter, had handled this situation, and how President Trump was willing to take very, very decisive action against a top leader of Iran. So he was trying to show to his constituency in America that they could rely on him, that he was no softy, that he was a tough fellow.
Right, absolutely, Vivek Kaju. Well, we'll have to certainly see how the numbers play out for Donald Trump domestically, and whether Americans actually have the appetite for another war or more tensions in the Middle East. We know that America is, of course, fighting the longest battle in Afghanistan. We've made a mess of Syria as well. Thank you very much, Ambassador Kaju, for joining us and sharing your thoughts with us this evening.
Thank you.